Again, for those who are just joining us, my name is Chris Kerr, Executive Director of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. Thanks for being with us today. We're excited to have you and excited that you're preparing, either you or you're preparing a delegation to come to the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice in a month, which is a little bit scary and a little bit intimidating, to be sure. As some of you know, our theme for the teach-in this year is Radical Hope, Prophetic Action. And so I cannot think of a more important time for us to be taking prophetic action in our call to care for creation. It's very intentional to incorporate this element into our Advocacy Day portfolio. Because we're at such a critical time for our Earth and such a critical time for those impacted by the realities of climate change, which are all of us, of course, but particularly those who are most vulnerable, the poor, marginalized. And we see the interrelation of the issues of climate change, with other issues as well. And so last week we were talking about migration. And our migration talking points and the background to those, and there's a clear interrelation between the realities of people migrating and what we're talking about today. So for those who maybe aren't familiar, or this is your first time getting ready for a Teach-In Advocacy Day, on the Teach-In website, so if you go to ignatiansolidarity.net/IFTJ, and you look at, you kind of click over or hover over agenda and then click on the Advocacy Day, you're going to find the talking points that we're using today for for this session available there. It's a robust document that goes into some pretty deep detail on in terms of providing background for what we're going to be talking about today. There's also a number of other resources that are available there. I've placed the link for this in the chat box as well for those who are with us live right now. But as it says, the purpose of our visits to Capitol Hill on November 18th will be to call upon the U.S. government to exercise decisive leadership to mitigate climate change by supporting policies that reduce greenhouse gases and that protect people in poverty who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And we bring this message to Congress not as just individuals, but as people of faith, as people who are part of the Catholic community, who are responding to the call of our faith, the call of Pope Francis through his encyclical Laudato Si. And with that in mind, we're really excited to have with us Jose Aguto, who's the Associate Director of the Catholic Climate Covenant, with us today to provide some context. Catholic Climate Covenant, for one, ISN is a core partner. I think that's the term that we use to describe our relationship with Catholic Climate Covenant. We work with them on a regular basis. We're also really grateful for the work that they do nationally to invite us all into this mission of responding to Laudato Si and the call of our faith. And grateful to Jose for being with us today to provide some context to all this work. So I'm going to welcome Jose, and I've invited him to provide some general context about these issues, about what our faith tells us, about the things that we're calling on Congress and the Trump administration to do in the coming years related to climate change. We'll have a chance for Jose to speak to some of these points, and then we'll have a chance for some questions with Jose, and then we'll also get a chance to hear from Brenna Davis, who is our environmental justice issues director, to talk about some things that are happening in the Jesuit network related to responding to climate change. So Jose, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. We're grateful to have you. And I'm going to turn it over to you to provide some context and give us some insights on what we're asking our government to do related to current realities. So Jose.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Brenna, for providing me and the Covenant this opportunity. And I just want to say that the Ignatian Solidarity Network is one of the premier Catholic institutions and prophetic institutions within our U.S. Catholic Church. And you are so important, and I'm just blessed to be able to contribute, participate. Truly mean that. Look forward to future collaboration, and we'll talk about that later. And so Brenna asked me to provide, and Chris asked me to provide some context. I want to break this down into 3 parts. The first is to talk about the IPCC report and some of the scientific background. Then second, to talk about current US policy. And then the third is to talk about why we advocate upon this from the basis of our Catholic faith, and particularly Catholic young adults and youth, and why your voice today is so critical. With regard to the IPCC, as many of you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a organization composed of hundreds of member organizations, and they recently came out with a report in October of 2018 at the request of the UN to give the world the state of play with regard to our climate, and what the implications would be if the world were 2 degrees Celsius hotter versus 1.5 degrees Celsius hotter. And many of you who are familiar with the Paris Agreement know that the goal of that agreement is to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius warming, but ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. And so the IPCC came up with this report in 2018. The findings are not optimistic. We find the world actually continuing at a pace of greenhouse gas emissions that threaten the viability of our shared future. We do need to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the ultimate goal, as recommended by the UN, is for our world to be carbon neutral by 2050. Ambitious, audacious, unprecedented changes in the way that we produce energy, but we need this incredible, audacious energy transformation in order to have a viable, livable future for you and future generations. Some of the findings of the report, for example, comparing 2 degrees Celsius versus 1.5, are that 37% of the population will be subject to extreme heat at 2 degrees Celsius versus 14% of the population. So that's 2 times worse. If you imagine these increases in temperature, not as, whether it's more or less comfortable for you, but whether or not you have a fever. For example, 98.6 degrees versus 100 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees, you have a fever. So this is the way that we conceive of these temperature increases. Even slight variability will have significant changes in our ecosystems and the way that we can conduct ourselves. Another example is that we will have a 10 times worse degradation of sea ice. We potentially could have an Arctic that's free of sea ice at 2 degrees Celsius. I'm not going to belabor these points, and you can get many of them through reading the report or summaries of the report. But just to note that we are in a crisis situation, and that the IPCC, with its subsequent reports, with each subsequent report, is noting with increasing conviction about the causes of climate change, and with increasing granularity that these impacts are particularly harming our most vulnerable peoples, and that changes need to be done very, very quickly. Where does the US position itself, both internationally and nationally? And this is related to the asks that you will be carrying to Congress. First, on the international level, President Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. He stated that in June of 2017. And the administration is likely planning to announce formally their withdrawal on November 4th of this year, which is great timing for you, because then you can carry your ask to to the Senate and the House with regard to keeping the US in the Paris Agreement. And the administration, as an overall matter, has been unprecedented in its attacks on the environmental agenda, having rolled back over 80 regulations through the Environmental Protection Agency, from drinking water from lead to emissions to methane, across the board, attacks that we have never before seen. And so you see a very strident anti-environmental agenda coming from the administration on the domestic front. At the same time, we see in Congress, particularly in the House, the democratically controlled House, ideas and legislation that seek to maintain at least the concept of ambitious climate legislation on the books, so that we may hope in 2021, with the change of potentially the change of administration and changes in the composition of Congress, that these ideas will stay true and be live for consideration and potentially and hopefully passed, so that we may be able to enact the climate ambition that we need. And this is why you're here, is to help create and continue this momentum. We recognize that in this administration, in this Congress, there is highly likely not to be ambitious climate legislation, but you are continuing to build the momentum of climate action moving forward. Why is this important? On the international level, for better or worse, the US signals to the rest of the world. You may have heard the phrase, when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches cold. So we have seen with the administration's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement during the UN Climate Summit, which was held this September, many of the nations, the major emitting nations, walked away from the agreement, did not actually commit to the Paris Agreement. And the 65 countries that committed to carbon neutrality in 2050 were not the major emitting nations. So as an overall matter, only representing 8% of the world's global greenhouse gas emissions, this kind of tepid response and looking at the US signaling demonstrated an international timidity with regard to the ambition we need. And this was despite this incredible call by the younger generations, led principally by Greta Thunberg, to call for our nations, this very impassioned moral call for us to save our planet for present and future generations. Getting to the particular asks, in order to keep the United States in the Paris Agreement, Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire issued a bill, and this is your ask, the International Climate Accountability Act, which calls upon the administration to develop a plan to meet its commitments under the Paris Agreement. And that commitment is to keep US greenhouse gas emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels. And this would meet our commitments. And while they are modest, again, it is a major signal because 193 nations signed the Paris Agreement. And so this brings the United States back into the fold of global international cooperation, working together to keep global greenhouse gas temperatures under 1.5. The second ask is that both to the Senate and the House is to support carbon pricing legislation on the national level. Carbon pricing legislation is one of the most significant ways that we can quickly reduce domestic greenhouse gas emissions. It's not the only solution. If you use the metaphor of buckshot, and one of the most significant pieces of buckshot is reducing carbon emissions through the pricing of carbon. And some of the legislation, and there are actually 6 pieces of actually 7 pieces of carbon pricing legislation in the Senate and the House. 4 of them are bipartisan, many of which can significantly reduce our nation's global greenhouse gas emissions. So when you pair our return to the international negotiations with national legislation seeing significant reductions in national greenhouse gas emissions, you're having the international cooperation as well as our nation acting in word and deed to actually step into this commitment. And so together in 2021, we could see rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions through the passage of this legislation on both pieces. A significant dimension, though, we need to talk about from a Catholic perspective is that the carbon pricing legislation needs to ensure that we're providing protections for workers who are transitioning away from the fossil fuel industry. We also have to make sure that the income, the tax revenue that is derived from this carbon pricing legislation goes to low-income households, and that we provide funding to communities who are mostly directly impacted by the tangible realities of climate impacts. And finally, that we need to provide some funding to continue to manifest clean and renewable energy as major portions of our energy sector into the future as rapidly as possible. I would like to conclude by talking about our place as Catholics in climate advocacy. As many of you know, Pope Francis issued an encyclical in 2015 called Advocacy, which was calling us, not only Catholics, but all people and all people of goodwill, to adopt what we would call an integral ecology, where creation and our society are integrally linked for the thriving of human civilization as well as our Earth. We find as an overall matter that many other faiths were absolutely ecstatic about this encyclical, but that the U.S. Catholic Church itself has been a little bit slow to adopt it, and you are some of the major actors in making this a reality within our Catholic Church. Also wanted to note that prior to Pope Francis, that St. Paul II, as well as Pope Emeritus Benedict, both talked about the need for an integral ecology. And in fact, John Paul II talked about us having to have an ecological conversion. And so this Pope Francis, in a way, is echoing and amplifying and elevating that which his predecessors brought to the table. The second dimension of this is that, and I think perhaps the most important message I'd like to convey to you is that, as we all know, we are operating in a heavily partisan, heavily poisonous environment where you're seeing very ambitious efforts being stymied by the partisanship that we are witnessing. As people of faith, if we are grounded as people of faith, that the key element that we bring is to be peacemakers, is to transcend the bipartisan dialogue, transcend the partisanship through our place of faith, for calling for reconciliation, for reaching out to people who may have different opinions from us with love and compassion, as Jesus taught us, towards living the gospel so that we can be true agents of change. It is difficult in a way to say how critical this is, but if you are grounded in your faith, we together can transcend this and have, as Chris mentioned, this radical hope and this prophetic action moving forward. Lastly, I'll say, actually, let me just stop there. And no, let me just say this, sorry. In working with, sorry, Chris. So in working with Ignatian Solidarity Network, we are seeing incredible vigor and promise from U.S. Catholic young adults into lifting up their voice. And what you're doing is part of that. But you in particular are our future, literally. And as Greta said, in a way, chiding us adults for failing to act and for daring and hoping and asking for hope from you, we want to work with you and help galvanize the energy and the prophetic vision and action that you have to lift up our church and move our church to a place where we are looked upon as major significant actors in moving the moral needle of our nation's culture towards climate action. And so I'm blessed to work with you and look forward to your questions. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Jose. And again, we're joined right now by Jose Aguto from the Catholic Climate Covenant, and grateful for these perspectives that Jose's able to offer us as we prepare to be on Capitol Hill, to have over 1,500 predominantly young people on Capitol Hill to bring a message of radical hope for our church and for society. Jose, what we'll do is we'll open it up to questions. So if you have a question, we're going to ask you to submit it via the chat box in the Zoom window. So you can, if you don't notice that at the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a little voice bubble there that says chat. Just click on that and you can post a message that'll be a question that can be asked. But while we're waiting for some questions from the crowd, Jose, I had a question for you. You know, the church is engaged in so many important issues in society. We do work on migration. We have partners that do work on a lot of different issues. How is the church a moral authority on this issue? How, in your work across the country with Catholics, with Catholic parishes, dioceses, other entities, how is the church and as a network being a witness to this idea of radical change that we need to make in the context of responding to the realities of climate change? Can you identify any examples that you could share of where you're seeing this happen?
Multiple examples, but I will focus on one for now. And I learned this from Michael Tarian, who works for the Archdiocese of Chicago. I understand, and pardon me, this is hearsay, but that DePaul Campus Ministries engaged in a retreat on Laudato Si back in the spring, and bringing campus ministers from what was called the Chicagoland area, from as far north as Marquette and Milwaukee, down to Notre Dame and South Bend, and helping familiarize campus ministries as well as those college students who came to those to understand Laudato Si in a more intimate way. One of the promising efforts was that during the climate strikes, which happened a couple weeks ago, that 110 college students from these campuses, which were Catholic as well as non-Catholic, joined the climate strikes and are engaged in other activities now. And we're seeing this rising up, not just in Chicago, but in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts and in California and in other parts of the country, where you're seeing this great uplift of U.S. Catholic youth and young adults stepping into this, both from a demonstration perspective and a witness perspective, as well as working with their institutions to live out Laudato Si in action.
Thanks, Jose. That's a great example. Well, are you seeing Catholic communities that are changing their behaviors in any ways, or doing things that that kind of demonstrate that that we're, as a church, we're willing to change the way we operate, just like we're asking the government to kind of change the way we operate?
That's great. Yes, so I would say starting with the Vatican, they have committed to being carbon neutral. So there's a start there, leading by example. We do have, and I'll just move from the top down, if you will. We have also archdioceses issuing very bold statements. For example, the Massachusetts Catholic Conference, the California Catholic Conference, and the Atlanta Archdiocese stepping into this and encouraging the institutions underneath them to move forward. In terms of action, we, for example, the Covenant have over 300 parishes who are have creation care teams, where, for example, there's a diocese, St. Denis in Wisconsin, which has solar panels and is going carbon neutral by 2030. We've got solar panels in a Immaculate Conception parish in Hampton, Virginia, that has solar panels. And then actually on Thursday, the Catholic Covenant is hosting a press conference celebrating the installation of a 2-megawatt solar array in Washington, D.C., which is the largest solar array in D.C. Our partner and the actual recipients of this solar is Catholic Charities, which has, through this 2-megawatt solar array, will be carbon neutral and will save $250,000 in energy costs every year. So we're stepping into going green across the country now. You're seeing multiple kinds of efforts like this.
And some of these efforts are, just to contextualize this really quickly before we transition to Brenna, some of these efforts are coming through Catholic Climate Covenant's Catholic Energies program. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And could you just do like the 30-second commercial for that while we have you?
Sure. So Catholic Energies will help any a Catholic institution that's interested in putting a solar or other renewable energy on their buildings. We do so in a manner that provides financing and all of the technical support that an institution needs in order to make that happen. In essence, it's a one-stop shop that is especially useful for parishes, for example, that just don't have enough time to actually delve into the details.
Great.
CatholicEnergies.org.
Thanks, Jose. Well, on that note, we're going to transition over to Brenna Davis for a few minutes for Brenna to share some of the ways that the Ignatian Network is demonstrating their commitment to responding to the realities of climate change. And to kind of, when we walk into an office, I think it's good to kind of be able to speak to kind of that moral authority, to be able to talk about, these are some of the ways our network is responding, these are some of the ways our church is responding, and we're asking the government to respond as well. So Brenna, welcome. Thanks for taking time to talk about this as we prepare to head to Capitol Hill. I'm going to turn it over to you, Brenna, to give some examples of what's happening around the Jesuit network.
Yeah, there are, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jose. There are a lot of exciting things happening around the network, so I'm gonna just quickly, hopefully share some slides that I have with you, and we will, okay. So we have some great things happening in the network. First off, the College of the Holy Cross, they actually established a presidential task force on the environment. So just showing from the top down that they really had buy-in and a commitment from the administration. They actually then, because of that task force, set a carbon neutral plan. And they have actually reduced their emissions by 46.8% from 2007 and are on track to be carbon neutral by 2040. And this is through a variety of initiatives from the way that they're doing construction and encouraging transportation on campus, waste, maintenance, food services, and also student initiatives. So really a great example of top-down support for environmental action. Next up, we have the University of San Francisco. They actually achieved their carbon neutrality goal about 30 years ahead of their goal set for 2050. And they did this, they really emphasized that it was like the large and small steps that mattered and that they really needed to address the issue from both ends. So they did everything from changing their cleaning supplies to also using micro turbines and also mission-driven carbon offsets. So some of those were reforestation projects, capturing methane gas in garbage dumps, and they also did all of the efforts on campus, such as water and food waste and energy conservation. They were some of the first adopters or very early adopters of solar thermal hot water and also solar panels. And they've actually reduced their water consumption on campus by 30% since 2014. So they are just a very good model of what you can do with administrative support. Our last university example from the network is Loyola University in Chicago. They have an Institute of Environmental Sustainability, and this is a really amazing program that they have at the university. It opened in 2013, and so it has classrooms and research opportunities for students. So not only are they putting into practice things like including solar panels and aquaponics and gardening, but they're actually having students research these issues to be able to contribute to solutions in the future. They also have a campus climate action plan, and their goal is to be carbon neutral by 2025. And they're also the host of an annual climate change conference in the Midwest, which is just a really awesome thing that they offer. These are just some pictures from their campus. So they have an indoor greenhouse. They have more green rooftops than any other university in the Midwest. They also have a biodiesel lab, which turns campus waste into diesel that then they can use to fuel their cars on campus. And they also have an aquaponic system. So just a really great example of how universities can really support environmental initiatives. Going to the secondary level, Jesuit Portland is a leader, an example of what can happen at the high school level. So they actually built a center for science and mathematics that is seeking gold certification from the LEED certification program. And this is fitted with solar panels, low flow fixtures, and they use recycled building materials to create this learning center. They've also hired an associate director of ecological justice and global networking. So again, just that commitment at the institutional level to have someone who's managing sustainability issues full time. And they also have a variety of zero waste initiatives on campus. And our final example, this is one of the ISN member network schools. And so this is Bishop ODowd High School in Oakland, California. And so they actually built a Center for Environmental Studies that is LEED Platinum certified. It's one of 20 net zero energy verified buildings in California, and it has everything from solar panels to natural lighting to rainwater harvesting. They also have a living lab, so basically the building leads out into a 4-acre garden that is drought resistant, so students can actually use the outdoor classroom and take their learning kind of out into nature. They also have a 4 Cs framework, so they think about sustainability on their campus, in their curriculum, in their community, and in their culture. And so they have a plan for each level of that in their campus community. And finally, they also have a spiritual ecology program, and they actually hosted a conference in 2019, a spiritual ecology conference, talking about some of the, including indigenous voices from the land that their school is currently on. And they also have an eco-leadership team that is made up of students and faculty from the school to kind of continue the forward progress. So I think these are all really hopeful signs when it can feel a little frustrating, like, you know, like how do we get recycling started on our campus? We do have really good models in the network of some really progressive things happening that we can point to encourage other organizations and structural change in our institutions.
Thanks, Brenna. And thinking about these examples, and there are likely other examples within the network that we aren't aware of, right? At institutions that maybe are evolving or just better kept secrets. As we think about going to Capitol Hill and talking with staff of legislators, you know, how can some of these stories and the stories from our own institutions be part of effective strategies for talking with folks on the Hill? And secondly, are there other types of stories that we might want to bring or think about bringing to those meetings as well?
Yeah, and I would love to respond to this, and I also invite Jose to respond as well if he is interested. But I think that really, like you said, being able to point to these examples and say, you know, our institutions are doing these things, and so the, you know, the kind of the federal government needs to catch up and stay at pace with what's happening on a local level. I also think, as you kind of alluded to, storytelling is really important. Climate is really complex, and we're talking about, you know, differentials of like half a degree and kind of the the level of impact that that makes. And so sometimes that doesn't capture people's hearts and minds. And so I think that any stories that you can share about either frontline communities, so people that you see in your community, or maybe members of your own community who are currently being impacted by climate change. So, you know, if you live in a community where there's a lot of farming, I know there was a lot of flooding in Nebraska. If you work with people experiencing homelessness and or have like a LABRA program, sharing some of those stories about how these shifts are impacting people, I think is really important. And then finally, I would just say any connections that you can make between issues is really important. So something that we're trying to do at ISN is start to kind of make clear the connections between different justice issues. So the idea that climate change is very tied into migration and migration patterns and what's happening in Central America. You know, the coffee crops failed in Guatemala, and that forced a lot of people to have to make the difficult decision to migrate. And so I think that the more that we can share people's stories and connect climate change to issues that are sometimes easier for people to see or easier for people to relate to is really important.
Those are some good points. I don't know if Jose has anything else to add to that.
Thank you, Chris and Brenna. I wanted to compliment what you're talking about by saying you as constituents coming from wherever you're from to Washington, D.C. to speak with your legislator is one of the most influential ways to move your legislator to act. There have been studies about this, and I used to be a lobbyist, and I used to bring other constituents from my other organizations that find that you, the constituents, are the most persuasive voice. So you are engaging in democracy, and that you don't need, as Brenna mentioned, you don't need to be an IPCC scientist, and you don't need to be talking about the polywonky dimensions of the legislation, but to speak from your heart and to speak from your experience.
Thanks, Jose. And again, we've been joined today by Jose Aguto from the Cali Climate Covenant and Brenna Davis from the Nation Solidarity Network. And my name's Chris Kerr at ISN. And we're grateful for your efforts as you prepare to be on Capitol Hill next month. And make sure to check out those resources at the Teach-In website. That's ignationsolidarity.net/IFTJ. And then if you hover over agenda, you'll click on the Advocacy Day tab. You'll find the migration talking points. You'll find many other materials, some instructions on planning your meeting, information about the public witness, which will happen that morning, and how we would approach the day if there were rain. So lots of good and important resources there. And you can always reach out to our program director, Aaron Brown, at ebrown@nationsolidarity.net for assistance with any of these materials as well. Thank you again for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you in November. Have a great night.